Hello, and welcome to This Week in Sociological Perspective. I'm your host, Samuel Roundfield Lucas. This week, we discuss college parents' hiring of a private security firm to patrol a campus area neighborhood in Philadelphia. But first, I recently spoke with Professor Mike Vuolo of Ohio State University about his recent paper titled Surveillance, Self-Governance, and Mortality: The Impact of Prescription Drug Monitoring Programs on U.S. Overdose Mortality 2000 to 2016. The paper is to be published in the Journal of Health and Social Behavior, and is co-authored by Laura C. Frizzell and Brian C. Kelly. Professor Vuolo, thank you for joining us.
Very happy to be here.
So, your study is of drug overdose death rates, specifically on the possible impact of a particular policy, prescription drug monitoring programs. What are prescription drug monitoring programs and how do they work?
I mean, think of it as just a database that a state might keep of everyone who's gotten a prescription for a controlled substance. So to be a controlled substance, it has to be part of the Controlled Substances Act, either defined by the federal government or a state. So it's quite literally just a very large database of every prescription that's been given out in a given place. And they haven't, not every place has had one for, some have long histories, some states and some don't. But it's very straightforward to think of it. That's the overriding definition.
What kinds of drugs are covered? So, I mean, I have a, because when you say controlled substance, since I don't,
so
I'm not a chemist, I don't know what counts as a controlled substance. So, not that that's the only kind of person that would know that, but I have no idea. So
there are usually 5 schedules, at least the federal government's definition, that there are 5 schedules. States can move the definitions around to be more serious if they want, or to add substances that aren't covered by the federal government. At the top of the federal government's scheduling, you have things like heroin, methamphetamine, cannabis, and MDMA or ecstasy. And then in schedule, so those are considered substances that have no medical purpose with high addictive potential. Then the next category down would be high addictive potential, but has a medical purpose. And so as you move down through the 5 levels, it's sort of less addictive potential. And when you get to the lower levels, these are ones that you might be familiar with because they have, for example, codeine in them. So codeine's an opioid, and so that is a controlled substance. All opioids are controlled substance. And so the lower tier ones will be easier for doctors to write prescriptions for relative to the ones that are higher, which have sort of dosage limits and no refills, for example. But states can add their own controlled substances. So, one example that's very variable across states is kratom. And so kratom is a plant that does act on opioid receptors, even though it's not an opioid proper that we usually think of that comes from the opioid plant. And so some states you can get that at, gas stations or other head shops, as they're known. But in other states, it's completely controlled. So it does vary.
So when you say controlled, also, does that map on perfectly with prescription? So something that's controlled requires a prescription and something that's not controlled does, or does that not map?
No, so controlled would be something that has to have addictive potential. So, a prescription for heart medication is a prescription, but it is not controlled. So when we say prescription drug monitoring programs, we're talking about those ones that have addictive potential.
I see. And so what would constitute a violation if it's just this big database? I mean, if somebody broke the law on the prescription drug monitoring program.
Yeah, so you have 2 sides of this, and that's why we do think our paper is interesting, because you have behavior for the dispensers and providers, and then you have behavior for individuals. And so for the dispensers and the providers, they could have their medical license revoked if they, for example, write a prescription that goes over the dosage that aligns with the patient's issues, or maybe give a substance that shouldn't have been given. And the database would pick up patterns, and to the degree to which any state has someone overlooking it is probably different, but it would identify a pattern for a dispenser or a provider, and sort of flag it. And on the individual side, there's sort of this idea that individuals can skirt it by doing things like doctor shopping, so going to different doctors to get the same prescription for the same problem, and this would pick up on that they got the same prescription multiple times. Of course, there are ways around that too. If you live near a border of a state, you could potentially go on both sides and avoid detection, but it's intended to pick up on those kinds of things.
So why would we expect there to be an effect of prescription drug monitoring programs on overdoses?
Well, there's a really easy example to this that was highly publicized, which is that West Virginia, I don't know their population off the top of my head, but they had an insane amount of opioid prescriptions that would never map onto the population, right? Which it means that there's opioids flooding that particular state, and the more they're available, the more we would expect there to be potential that people would become addicted, that would be giving it for reasons it didn't need to be given, that doctors weren't trying to wean people off once they didn't need it anymore. And so that would be part of the reason that we would think it'd be related to overdose. And then there is individuals do experience a tolerance, and so they'd have to take more and more to experience the same effect, specifically for opioids. And so that could result in an overdose. And also, our paper looks at opioids, benzodiazepines, which are tranquilizers for anxiety, for example, and psychostimulants, which include prescription stimulants like you would get for Ritalin, for example, for ADHD. And so some of those classes are synergistic, which means that they are not the sum of their parts. So like take a benzodiazepine and an opioid at the same time, it is a very heightened risk for overdose. So those are other reasons that you could imagine that restricting certain classes, you wouldn't be able to have that synergistic effect.
Are there any theories or reasons to suggest that the prescription drug monitoring program would not have an effect?
Yeah, and that's actually something that we do look at in our paper, because there's sort of these, we call them the waves of the opioid epidemic, or the overdose epidemic. The first wave was prescription drugs. That was the primary cause of most of the overdoses. And then as we realized that, and there were some adjustments, including prescription drug monitoring programs, the next wave was heroin, as people turned to the illicit market. And then the new wave, the most recent wave then, it was fentanyl, which is a synthetic opioid that's usually produced illicitly, that is incredibly strong. And then the fourth wave now is that combined with psychostimulants like methamphetamine. So, we wouldn't expect prescription drug monitoring programs to necessarily affect all those illicitly produced substances, for example.
So the idea is that if people are shifting, then you have this drug monitoring program, but they've shifted to something else, and so the overdose rates and the mortality rates don't change. They just, or right, if anything, they go up. But because
they go up
if the things are more, if the new substances are more addictive or more easy to overdose or something.
Well, they're unregulated too, right? It's not just that they tend to be stronger, but you don't always know what you're getting, so you can't dose properly.
Right.
Yeah.
So you're covering, in the paper, you cover the 2000-2016 period. And so when you turn to the data, which sounded extensive, did you find effects of the prescription drug monitoring programs?
Yeah, so we were interested in not just the presence of the prescription drug monitoring programs, but some of the details, because the states differ in let's say, the rules. So the specifics that we're interested in is, first, we just looked at whether there was a prescription drug monitoring program, but we followed that up by looking at whether there are rules about access and requirements to check. So the reason we did this is the first sense of just looking at prescription drug monitoring programs generally is examining whether there's an effect just because people and providers know they exist. But then so then the next question is, well, what if you make it so that, okay, now they have access so they can check themselves if they want to. And then what happens if you make it a requirement that they have to check? So without a requirement, it's basically, somebody's watching, but you don't necessarily, so you might change your behavior to some degree, but you aren't the one sort of taking the action to check the system. And then eventually, if it's required, now it's not only that you're being watched, but you have to change your behaviors. It's like a requirement to change your behavior. So the question was, did we find if they were effective, right?
Yes, but one clarification. So when you say access and requirement, access for whom and requirement?
For providers and dispensers.
Okay, so the doctor who's writing the prescription can maybe have access or maybe not have access, and or they may be under a regime that requires them to do something vis-a-vis the database versus not.
Right, and same thing for pharmacists. So that's what I mean by dispensers.
Okay.
Yeah. And so what we did find was that there was a significant effect when PDMPs, that's the abbreviation, prescription drug monitoring programs, went into effect. It took a couple years to take effect, though. So to see those effects, it took about 2 years for overall, and then for 1 to 2 years for depending on the substance. But so there's a little bit of a lag, which makes sense as people sort of adjust their behavior, knowing that the system exists. But and so the majority that existed for the period under consideration, for at least about 8 to 10 years, didn't give access or require access. And what we did find is that those stronger elements didn't necessarily change anything. So that it was basically implementing any system had an effect, and the strengthening it did not.
So so you live in a state, it doesn't have the prescription drug monitoring program. 1 year they enact the program, but they don't require anything. They don't require people check it or right. And then the providers or dispensers check it, and then but within a couple years, 2 to 3 years, you see a decline in overdose mortality.
Yep, and that's sustained through 5 years. At least that's, there's a cap that you have to make on the analysis, but the figures we show, it's at least through 5 years.
So how do you explain this pattern that the adoption of the policy with a lag makes a difference, but the strengthening of it doesn't?
So I think there's both a theoretical explanation and sort of a practical explanation. I think the theoretical explanation is that we just know, as providers or dispensers or individuals who are seeking to doctor shop, for example, we just need to know there's somebody's watching, right? And this is sort of links to Michel Foucault's work, which is that we only need to know that we're being watched, observed, to shift our behavior. And so doctors knowing that that the state is using the system to check up on them shifts their behavioral patterns to either give out fewer prescriptions or to not necessarily take on new patients or give it to new patients they're unfamiliar with. And then individuals might adjust their behavior as well, knowing that they're being watched. On the other hand, the access and requirements, like we don't need to be told to shift our behavior. Foucault's big argument is that it's better to let people think they have choice than to make them do something. And so to shift their behavior. So that's what we're finding. That's the theoretical reason. The practical sort of, go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, well, one thing about the theoretical reason. So it's better to make people believe they have choice, but to do that, I'm trying to just get how that happens. So people have choices, and then in comes this prescription drug monitoring program. And so they still have the same, I'm asking you, is this the correct way to think about this? They think they still have the same choices, but now they're aware that their choices are visible to others.
Right. So Foucault's famous example is the panopticon, right? So like it's an analogy of the prisoner who's in the cell and knows they're being watched by a guard, but they don't ever know when the guard will actually be watching, right? So they have to change their behavior because otherwise they'll never know whether they should or not.
Right.
And so it's that sort of like there's a subtle guardian that allows us to change our behavior. There's other examples like schoolwork. We don't have to sit next to our students and watch them study for an exam. They know an examination is coming up. We don't have to be there to do that. And health was actually his third domain. So his famous examples are criminal justice, school, and health. And he called it biopower, that the state just needs to subtly shift our behaviors to improve public health. Now, Foucault was critical of the state, but he did recognize that even some things can have end up having positive outcomes for health generally.
Okay, so now I think I have my head around this theoretical reason of just the existence of the program, even if nobody's monitoring it, lets dispensers and providers know there's a prospect they could be monitored, and then they change their behavior because in light of that. But they still have the same choices. They still have the same choices.
Yeah, and so Foucault's idea was the state can just subtly push people towards what they want, the state wants, right? By doing this. And there's another example we have at the end of the paper just to link it to some other work from an economist recently who showed that OSHA, when they just started putting up flyers in places, because you're required to post these OSHA warnings for workplace safety. And once they started putting up these warnings where they caught people violating them, it reduced workplace violations at large. So, just enough to know, oh man, OSHA really is watching. We should change our behavior. So that's, I think there's other examples where this fits as well.
Mm-hmm.
The practical reason is sort of the evolution of the overdose crisis that I described earlier. So prescription drug monitoring programs are one of the first sort of attempts to reduce overdoses. And so especially when the crisis was related to prescription drugs, you would assume that would be that's the target, right? The prescription drug monitoring programs target the very thing that is driving overdoses. So then there's a sort of in the pattern, a trail off of overdoses due to prescription drugs. And as I mentioned, the next step was heroin. And so again, the PDMPs don't target illicit substances. So, you can, and that's precisely the period where states were like, we need to make the prescription drug monitoring program stronger because the overdose crisis keeps going up. But by that time, the pattern of substances was already on the sort of a shift.
So the program is at that point in the second wave. The program, strengthening that program is maybe great, but it doesn't target the kind of drug that people have shifted to.
Right, and we actually showed that what are called lead effects, which is that the heroin overdoses preceded the strengthening, so that was really driving. Like part of the strengthening was these other substances actually were leading it.
Oh. It's interesting. So one thing is the prescription drug monitoring program is, basically a program of the healthcare system, not the criminal justice system.
Right.
And now some analysts have argued that prescription drug abuse, and especially opioid addiction, has afflicted whites more than blacks, for example, because whites receive more treatment for pain than do blacks. And getting treated for pain is how many people were first exposed to these addicting drugs. Anything I'm saying might be misunderstood, might be incorrect. So you just let me know if these premises are incorrect too. I don't want to. But if that's true, then it's interesting that while it's possible to have it's possible they could have had a criminal justice response to prescription drug, abuse, right? But what we get, I'm not saying, I don't know the states, I don't know which ones did or which ones didn't, but what we're getting in a lot of states is this prescription drug monitoring program. So that's a long lead up for my question, which is, do your findings say anything about the possible efficacy of exploring non-criminal justice approaches for other kinds of addictive drugs? I'm not sure that something like the prescription drug monitoring program really fits, because as you said, if it's but basically doing something that's not focused through criminal justice, but focused through other societal institutions like health.
I have a lot of thoughts here. One, just for listeners to understand the academic process, there was a version of this paper at a previous journal that got rejected that had all those analyses that you're asking for by race. So instead, we're spinning it off right now as a second article, a follow-up, and we find that these programs were only effective for white overdose rates and not for Black or Latinx. So that's one way of background. The second thing I'd say is that the initial uptick was most dramatic for white people, but in the last about 5-6 years, the Black overdose rate has actually completely outpaced the white overdose rate. So that it's like a problem that's going unrecognized. So I have another article with my former advisee, Sade Lindsay, who's at Cornell now. She and I looked at sort of the rhetoric around opioids, compared it to the crack cocaine epidemic of the 80s. And, it's very much depicted as a white problem, even though in the last 5 years, it's really been a problem across sociodemographics. And that's something that is people are talking a lot about now, is that it's changing rapidly. So let's then circling back to the actual question, which is, okay, now what do we do in terms of efficacy? Well, so there's a issue here in that thinking of that article that I had just mentioned, the one with Sade Lindsay, that's in Social Problems. The reaction is, we need more treatment. And so treatment itself is sort of let's call it race neutral for a second. But the problem is, geographically, it's not necessarily lining up with everyone who needs it. So the policies, even those policies, as they're enacted, might benefit white people more who access healthcare more often than for racial and ethnic minorities. And so in terms of incorporating it into the health system, it's really dealing with the underlying levels of discrimination that caused, and distrust that caused, the initial reason that the white rate went up so drastically, and trying to apply that now to the rates for other racial ethnic categories. But that sort of uptick that I said, so especially the Black overdose rate has really skyrocketed, but it's during the period for the illicit drugs, right? It's not the first wave, it's the second, third, and fourth wave, and those are already the substances that we use a criminal justice response for. So that's why we'd have to take more of a tack that is doing something like increasing treatment availability in underserved neighborhoods, because the prescription drug monitoring programs are likely not going to affect that to a strong degree. There are other strategies. So, other boxes we could tick, like Good Samaritan programs. So, Good Samaritan programs, if someone overdoses, no one involved who calls the cops would be criminally liable for anything that is found at that location. I mean, up to a degree. But those kind of programs would be universal if applied by a state, and anyone would avoid criminal. So the sort of distrust of calling the police or first responders in an overdose could be reduced. Same thing for naloxone availability for first responders to have naloxone. That only applies to opioids. It's an opioid antagonist, meaning it reverses the opioid effect. But having that available for first responders would also be a way to sort of a neutral policy, if you will.
Well, it's there's a story there in the beginning of your discussion about how papers get altered in this process. So I look forward to that, getting more details on that. But I guess and it sounds like a very complex terrain, different kinds of drugs, different kinds of processes by which they are placed into the public. Some going through pharmacies, others not. Different markets, and so it sounds like a very complex terrain. Given that, are there any other, which I think you did it was illuminating to hear you to talk about that. There's a lot of work to be done analytically and a lot of work to be done, programmatically. But are there any other lessons that politicians and policymakers you'd like them to draw from the results, or sensitivities they should have as they think about these issues?
Yeah, I think, the idea that we can just pass certain policies where it's enough to change provider and dispenser culture, as opposed to having let's be clear, doctors are pretty protective over their practice as a body of professionals. And so, creating a system where we're not saying, look, doctors, you need to change everything you do is beneficial, because it doesn't require any professional organization to tell all its members to do something differently. And same thing for pharmacists. So in thinking about policies that we can implement where we don't have to then rely on other people to go about that implementation. I mean, that's one of the biggest issues with passing any policy. Lawmakers can say it, but then the people on the ground who actually have to do it, we're not always sure that they will. And so this kind of idea that you can create a system that the state, can implement, that we don't have to necessarily rely on the individuals to see an effect. That's not to say we shouldn't strengthen PDMPs. It's just that, we can take a first step and hopefully see results.
Well, Professor Vuolo, I want to thank you for doing this immensely important work, and for being willing to share it with us today. I learned a lot. There's a lot to think about, so I appreciate it. Thank you.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Our final segment concerns the use of private security in a campus area neighborhood. A WPVI news report titled "Concerned Parents Band Together, Hire Private Security Near Temple University Campus," and an Inside Higher Education article titled "Temple Parents Hire Private Security" describe the circumstances that led some parents of Temple collegians to arrange for private security. Jennifer Hedberg, Massachusetts parent of a Temple University senior, was concerned about a noted rise in homicides in Philadelphia. In 2021, there were 562 murders in Philadelphia, up from 499 murders in 2020. 103 murders had been committed by March 15th of this year, a pace slightly higher than that of the record year of 2021. But it was the murder of Temple University student Samuel Collington that led her and other parents to contract with a private security force to patrol the neighborhood. The Temple University Police Department stated that, with respect to the private security firm's patrol, quote, "We want to help and support their efforts in any way we can," unquote. Neither Inside Higher Education nor WPVI interviewed any longtime residents of the area or residents of nearby neighborhoods, so we do not know if they are welcoming to or wary of the private patrols. We do know that we can consider this development using Albert Hirschman's framework of exit, voice, and loyalty. Hirschman argued that customers or clients of businesses or social service providers have two possible responses when services decline or when prices rise. One response is to stop using that service provider, to exit. The other response is to complain to the service provider in hopes of motivating an improvement, to voice. Hirschman noted that customers or clients voice whose dissatisfaction, Hirschman noted that customers or clients who voice their dissatisfaction are providing the service provider important information that could be used to address the problem. If a customer or client simply exits, that too is information, but it is not as empowering because the provider only knows there was dissatisfaction, but the cause of the dissatisfaction remains unclear. Hirschman further maintained that there is a difference in who responds when services decline versus who responds when prices rise. When service declines, the people most likely to exit are those who care the most about quality. However, when prices rise, the people most likely to exit are those who care least about the service. What this means is that if quality declines, the people most likely to extricate themselves from dependency on the service provider are the very people most likely to care enough about quality to complain to the service provider. Consequently, the exit of those who care the most can reduce the chances of quality improving for everyone by reducing the chance that enough people will complain to make a difference. Loyalty, the third element in the perspective, explains that people committed to a service provider tend to use voice rather than exit, at least initially. Indeed, people who are loyal are likely to threaten to exit before actually following through. A threat to exit is actually an exercise of voice. It is one possibly last-ditch effort to impress upon the provider that improvement is imperative. In contrast, people without loyalty to the provider are likely to exit without voicing any threat at all. Now, consider the rising gun violence in Philadelphia, a danger rising not only in the area around the Temple University campus, but throughout much of the city. Service providers might reduce the incidence of gun violence by conducting by-the-book investigations that result in arrest and conviction of perpetrators, which could remove offenders who might repeat their gunplay and endanger others. Service providers, such as police officers, could increase patrols and could adopt or enhance community policing, an approach that, by building positive relationships between people in the community and other authorities, might increase the sense of community belonging enough to make potential perpetrators reluctant to use or threaten deathly violence. Alternatively, community policing might help trusted authorities learn enough with time enough to intervene before matters escalate to gun violence. It is not difficult to imagine additional strategies that could play a role in bringing down the incidence of gun violence and the homicide rate. But the strategies I mentioned, and all of the strategies one might imagine, require personnel, time, and commitment. All, therefore, require money and other resources. Now, taking that into consideration, in the Hirschman framework, the city is a service provider, and safe streets are the service. And the student, their parents, and other city residents have two options. They can leave, or they can complain. The college students' parents arranged for private security. So how might we think about this choice in the Hirschman framework? One way is to see the provision of private security as exit, and that those living in the privately patrolled area have extricated themselves from the city's monopoly on policing. But the exit isn't complete, for the Philadelphia Police Department remains responsible for law enforcement throughout the city, even in the neighborhoods being covered by this private security patrol. Thus, this partial exit means that this neighborhood will be more policed than other city neighborhoods. This means that the criminals aware of the heightened policing will likely move to other neighborhoods. Consequently, the parents willing and able to pay for private security for the college-adjacent neighborhood in which their children live are probably lowering their children's exposure to risk. But they are simultaneously likely to be raising the risk of residents of nearby neighborhoods of exposure to violence. Now, make no mistake, we can easily understand the urge to take action to supplement the safety of our loved ones, and taking steps to increase their safety is not wrong. However, it is also true that one sociological implication of this response is to shift risks onto others. the overall risk does not necessarily decline, it just gets reallocated to other people. Principally, people less able to supplement their protection by hiring private security services. And this is an interesting implication of the exit, voice, and loyalty framework. Exit of public services is only possible when people have substitutes to which they can turn. In a society with a high degree of inequality, only some people or families have those options. In this case, it is likely that most city residents cannot afford private security, so they are at the mercy of whatever quality and level of services law enforcement officials can provide. While Temple University administrators have welcomed the provision of private security, neither news report mentioned a response from the City of Philadelphia Police Department. Be that as it may, Hirschman does warn of additional dysfunctions that may arise in light of his framework. He notes that some customers or clients may use voice to vocalize repeated demands, and some providers may prefer that those clients exit rather than have to repeatedly encounter the protests that they incite. So Hirschman notes, the lazy monopolist may rid himself of the voice of these customers. He can extend just to them especially high-quality, gold-plated service. The purpose would be to buy freedom to deteriorate. That is to say, freedom to let the services that they're providing continue to decline. Through Hirschman's framework, we can see beyond the scary reality of a college senior afraid to walk in their own neighborhood to the implications of individuals' self-protective actions on the prospects and risks of others. When we look more closely, we find that our fates are linked through the social world, linked such that primarily individual efforts at protection likely only shift the risk from one group to another and perhaps back again. Certainly, pursuing an individual strategy is understandable and well within anyone's human rights. Yet, we can also ask, is shifting the burden from one vulnerable person to another really the best that we can do? That's This Week in Sociological Perspective. We'll be back next week with another interview with an author of some important sociological research and more sociological insights on an issue in the news. Till then, take care.